Hello everybody and welcome to the third video in our series of videos on the American War of Independence. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know what the Boston Massacre was and the events that led up to it. Second, you guys should know what led to the Boston Tea Party and what it was. And third, you guys should know what the Intolerable Acts were and a consequence of them. So as you can tell from our learning outcomes, the majority of the action in this video takes place in this place here, Boston, which was in the colony of Massachusetts. There were incidents and protests in all of the colonies. The actions of those in Boston stand out as crucial steps towards the outbreak of the war. So today's events begin like last week's ended with another act being passed. And this time there was a series of acts called the Townshend Acts, which were passed in 1768. The main consequence of the Townshend Acts was that it placed import taxes on things like glass, lead, paper and tea. So if you were importing or buying anything from Britain, then you needed to pay extra money or a tax on it. Again, because they weren't represented in the government, the colonists around Boston protested against the new taxes. They sent a letter of petition to King George III, asking him to take back the acts and try to organise the rest of the colonies to boycott importing any goods with these new taxes. This ill discipline from the colonists in Massachusetts led to the British sending troops to Boston. The British troops were known as the Redcoats, and they were there to ensure that the people of Boston and Massachusetts didn't step out of line like they did in the Stamp Act, where the protests began to get violent. So tensions between the Bostonians and the soldiers simmered really for 2 years, from 1968, and then finally on the 5th of March in 1770 it boiled over when a British soldier opened fire on a crowd of Bostonians they had been assaulting a soldier after he had hit a civilian. 5 people ended up being killed and 6 were injured, and the event became known as the Boston Massacres. So the big thing about the Boston Massacres was that it was really a war of propaganda, and the colonists, they campaigned to try to show the public that the British were brutal, violent dictators who didn't care about the colonists. They tried to gain sympathy for the American cause of greater freedom from the British. This led to the Townshend Acts being mostly repealed in April of 1770 because the British realised that they were more trouble than they were worth, but they kept an import tax on tea just to show the colonists that they were in their rights to tax them on whatever it is they wanted to tax them on. There was relative calm in the colonies for the next few years until the introduction of the final act that we're going to be meeting, the Tea Act of 1773. So the Parliament in Britain, they passed an act saying that this British company called the British East India Company could sell their tea directly into the colonies without using the middlemen or the merchants. So remember, up until this point, if you were selling something from Britain to the colonies, you sold it to merchants in America who then sold it on. So this new act cut out the middleman, and it would endanger the jobs of these merchants. The reason the British did this is because the British East India Company was so corrupt that it was on the verge of bankruptcy, and this was almost the equivalent of like a government bailout. Now, many colonists obviously were not happy, and they feared that this would be just the first of these actions that would lead to merchants losing their jobs. So this led to a reaction in Boston when a group of men led by an organisation known as the Sons of Liberty boarded a ship with British East India Company tea on it in December of 1773. They boarded the ship and they dumped all the tea overboard into Boston Harbour. It was around £10,000 worth of tea, the equivalent of about 27 million tea bags, which is a lot of tea. This incident is known to history as the Boston Tea Party. However, it had profound consequences for the people of Boston. it led to a reaction from the British, who passed something known as the Intolerable Acts. So these acts punished the colony of Massachusetts. First of all, they closed the port until they repaid the East India Company. Second, they closed the Boston Assembly. And third, they appointed General Gage as governor, and he brought in martial law or military law. This in turn brought a reaction from the people of Boston. They used a form of public torture or humiliation known as tarring and feathering, and these acts were taken as revenge on customs officials or people who were they felt who should have been loyal to the colonists who were helping the British. They had practiced tarring and feathering to the customs officials before the Intolerable Acts, but after the Intolerable Acts, they became more widespread in the year 1774. And pictures like the one you can see here would have been used as propaganda back in Britain to show how evil a practice this was that the colonists were engaging in. As a consequence of all of this, the colonies decided to call a meeting to discuss how to react to the implementation of the Intolerable Acts in September of 1774, and this was known as the First Continental Congress. And we will look more at the Continental Congress in the next video. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So you guys should now know what the Boston Massacre was and the events that led up to it. You guys should know what led to the Boston Tea Party and what the Boston Tea Party was. And finally, you guys should know what the Intolerable Acts were and one of the consequences of them, whether that being the increase in public disorder with tarring and feathering or the meeting of the First Continental Congress. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.